The rain came without mercy that night. It fell like a curtain of silver needles against the black sky, washing the city in a kind of cruel silence that only the broken could understand. The wind howled down empty streets, carrying whispers of 1,000 unspoken sorrows. Streetlights flickered against the damp air, and distant thunder rolled like a warning to anyone still awake. On the edge of the city, far from the glowing towers and polished cars, the world was smaller, colder, and crueler there. By a deserted roadside near the old bridge sat a woman with torn clothes and trembling hands. Her name was Elena, though the world had stopped calling her that with kindness long ago. Her once neat hair was soaked, clinging to her pale face. Bruises painted her skin, old and new, each one a reminder of promises broken and freedom stolen. The rain mixed with the blood on her lips, washing away traces of her pain, but not the memory. Beside her, wrapped in her thin coat, was a little girl no more than 4 years old. The child's eyes were closed, her lashes wet, her tiny chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. Elena held her close, pressing the child against her body as if her warmth alone could fight the cold. Her fingers shook, not from the chill, but from fear, the kind that never truly leaves a woman once it's lived inside her. The city moved on without noticing. Cars passed, splashing puddles that reached her feet, headlights sliding across her face for a second before fading into the night again. N01 stopped. N01 asked, "To the world." She was invisible, another shadow in the rain, but somewhere deep inside her, a voice still whispered, faint, tired, but alive. It told her to keep holding on. To breathe one more time. To protect the small life in her arms, even if her own was falling apart. Elena had once dreamed of love, not the kind that burned and destroyed, but the kind that built. She imagined a home filled with laughter, sunlight streaming through curtains, the smell of breakfast on Sunday mornings. But her father's debt had stolen those dreams before they ever had a chance to live. He had given her away like a payment slip, a daughter traded for his freedom. The man she married had money, power, and a face that charmed the world. But behind closed doors, he was a storm that never stopped raging. Every bruise was a word she couldn't say. Every tear was a scream no one heard. Tonight, she had run. Barefoot at first, her heart pounding against her ribs as if urging her forward. The rain came down harder, soaking her as she clutched her daughter and ran through the dark. There had been no plan, only desperation, and no direction, only escape. The pain in her legs had given way to numbness, but she didn't stop. And now she sat on the side of the road, the taste of freedom bitter in her mouth. The night stretched endlessly before her, and fear whispered that he would find her. That he always did. But exhaustion won the war against fear, and she pulled her child closer, covering her small body with trembling arms as the storm raged on. Every sound became an echo of memory. The slamming of a car door reminded her of fists. The thunder reminded her of shouting. The flicker of headlights made her body flinch on instinct. She was no longer a woman. She was a ghost that refused to disappear. Still, even ghosts of hope, and that hope was the sleeping child she held. The tiny heartbeat pressed against her chest was the only proof that she hadn't been completely destroyed. In another part of the city, miles away, the world looked very different. Luxury cars glided through the rain with tinted windows and silent engines. Inside one of them sat a man who ruled half the underworld of New York, Damien Moretti. His name carried fear the way fire carries heat. The police knew him but couldn't touch him. His rivals envied him but dared not cross him. He was power wrapped in silence, the kind of man who didn't need to shout to be heard. But behind his cold eyes and calm voice lay a rule, one unbroken since the day he was born. Never raise a hand to a woman. His mother had taught him that long before the world taught him cruelty. She had told him, respect is what separates men from monsters. And somehow, even in the darkness of his world, he had held on to that one truth. His car rolled through the storm, the sound of rain tapping against the windows like restless fingers. The city lights blurred into streaks as they drove past the old bridge. He wasn't meant to stop there, but fate, as it often does, had other plans. From the corner of his eye, he caught a glimpse, a small figure hunched in the rain. Something fragile in a world too sharp. He almost ignored it. He had seen too many broken things in his life to care. But then he saw her arms wrapped protectively around a smaller shape, a child, and just like that, something inside him paused. The car slowed. The driver looked up in the mirror, waiting for an order that never came before. That was the moment everything began to shift. The moment when two worlds, one bleeding and one cold, collided beneath the same storm. The rain didn't know it yet, but it was washing away more than dirt that night. It was washing away the distance between pain and mercy, between destruction and healing, between a woman who had lost everything and a man who thought he had nothing left to give. The black sedan eased to a stop beside the curb, its engine humming low beneath the roar of the downpour. For a long moment, the wipers were the only sound, back and forth, cutting lines through the water that streamed across the glass. Inside, the men waited for an order. They had seen their boss hesitate before, but never like this. Damien Moretti's eyes stayed fixed on the blurred silhouettes outside. The rain made them ghost-like, the woman's form folding over the smaller one in her lap, both shaking with a kind of exhaustion that made the body forget how to move. A memory, uninvited and unshakable, rose in him. His mother, kneeling beside a stray dog that had been beaten in the street, her hands trembling as she whispered, "Everything deserves safety." He had been a boy then, small enough to believe her words could fix the world. "Boss?" the driver finally asked. Damien didn't answer. The door opened instead, and the cold air poured in. He stepped into the storm. Rain slicked his hair against his forehead, traced the lines of his jaw, soaked through the dark fabric of his coat. The pavement reflected the dull gold of the street lamp above him. He walked forward slowly, not wanting to startle what looked like fear wrapped in human skin. The woman didn't lift her head until his shadow fell across her. Even then, she didn't speak, only pulled the child tighter, as if protecting her from whatever new danger had come to finish the night. The child stirred, half asleep, half aware of the heavy footsteps beside them. The woman tried to shift away, but her strength gave out. Her shoulders shook, her breath came shallow and uneven. Rainwater ran from Damien's fingertips as he looked down at them. Two lives clinging to each other on the edge of the road, unnoticed by the world he controlled. The scene was wrong. Everything about it offended the order he kept in his empire. Pain without purpose, cruelty without gain. He turned his head toward the driver still waiting in the open car door. A slight nod. That was all it took. Within seconds, an umbrella appeared behind him. The rain above the woman softened. Another man came with a blanket from the trunk. Damien said nothing. He didn't need to. His men moved like echoes of his thoughts. The woman flinched when the blanket touched her shoulder. She looked up then, finally meeting his eyes. What he saw there hollowed something in him. It wasn't just fear. It was surrender, the quiet understanding that no one was coming to help. He crouched beside her, not too close. Water pooled around his boots. His coat dripped against the ground. The child's small hand clutched at her mother's sleeve. The mother's arms tightened again, instinctive, defensive. In the glow of the car lights, he noticed the marks on her face, faint lines of purple and blue around her cheekbone, bruises old enough to fade but not yet gone. Her lips were split, her knuckles swollen. There was a silence heavy enough to hear the rain itself, and in that silence, something shifted in him, small, unfamiliar, but undeniable. He gestured once more. The driver stepped forward, speaking softly, but the woman didn't move. She stayed frozen until the little girl whimpered in her sleep. That sound broke her. She nodded, almost imperceptibly, and let them lift the child from her arms. Damien followed behind them, holding the umbrella over both as they moved toward the car. By the time the doors closed, the storm had begun to fade, its roar turning into a tired whisper against the glass. Inside, the warmth hit them like a wave. The car's heater filled the space with soft air that smelled of leather and rain. The woman sat rigid, still dripping, eyes darting between the men who occupied the front seats. None of them looked back. None of them dared. Damien removed his coat and set it over the sleeping child. The gesture was small, almost unnoticed, but his men saw it through the mirror and understood. This was no ordinary night, and this woman was no one to be questioned. As the car pulled away from the curb, the city lights slid across her face. First shadow, then gold, then darkness again. Outside, the streets emptied. The bridge disappeared behind them. No one knew yet that everything in Damien Moretti's world had just begun to change. The city blurred past the car windows, endless streaks of neon bleeding into darkness. Inside, time seemed to slow, the hum of the engine blending with the rhythm of rain on the roof. The child slept soundly, her small fingers still curled around the edge of the coat that covered her. The woman sat beside her, body tense, eyes fixed on nothing. Fear lived in her bones. It showed in the way she breathed, shallow, uncertain, waiting for something bad to happen. It wasn't the kind of fear that comes suddenly. It was the kind that grows slowly, year after year, until it becomes part of who you are. The car moved through the heart of the city, crossing from broken streets into wide, clean avenues. Here, the lights burned brighter, shadows looked sharper. The world didn't see suffering here. It hid it behind glass towers and iron gates. As they approached the edge of the hills, the skyline fell away, replaced by silence and fog. The road wound upward until the house appeared, a fortress carved into stone, guarded by iron fences and men who didn't flinch even under thunder. The gates opened before the car stopped. They had seen the headlights and knew who it was. No one ever questioned Damien Moretti's decisions. The car slid through the long drive and stopped under a canopy of marble arches. The rain had softened into a mist, the kind that lingers when a storm has said what it needed to say. When the door opened, the world smelled of wet earth and steel. The woman hesitated. Her bare feet touched the ground, cold against the smooth stone. She lifted her child gently, the motion careful, protective. The mansion loomed above them, tall, dark, almost silent. Its windows glowed faintly, but the structure itself seemed to breathe a quiet warning. This is not a place where most people enter and leave the same. Yet tonight it opened for her. She stepped inside, and was swallowed by warmth and stillness. The scent of wood and faint tobacco filled the air. The floors were polished, reflecting soft gold from chandeliers that hung high above. Everything was too clean, too still, the kind of silence that could make someone forget what pain sounded like. Men in black suits stood along the hallway. They looked straight ahead, never at her. She didn't know if that was kindness or feared. A woman appeared from another room, older, calm, dressed simply. Her face carried the weight of obedience. Without a word, she led Elena down the corridor. The child was still asleep in her arms, unaware of how her world was changing with every step. The room they entered was vast, warm, and quiet. Thick curtains muffled the rain outside. A fireplace glowed faintly in the corner, painting the walls with trembling light. Clean towels and blankets had already been placed near the bed. The older woman pointed once toward them, then left silently, closing the door behind her. For a moment, Elena just stood there, staring at the bed like it was something foreign. It had been years since she had touched comfort that wasn't followed by pain. Her reflection in the window looked back at her, tired eyes, hollow cheeks, bruises fading into the paleness of her skin. She laid her child on the bed, pulling the blanket up gently to her chin. The little girl sighed in her sleep, the sound soft and innocent. For the first time in days, Elena exhaled without fear, but peace didn't come easily. Her body still waited for a shout, a strike, a hand that hurt. She sank to the floor beside the bed, her head resting on the mattress. Tears came slowly, not loud, not dramatic, just quiet rivers that refused to stop. It wasn't only pain leaving her, it was exhaustion, guilt, confusion. Everything she had held together for too long was falling apart in the safety of this unfamiliar room. Somewhere down the hall, footsteps echoed faintly, slow, measured, deliberate. They stopped outside her door but didn't enter. Then, after a pause, they faded again. It was Damien. He didn't need to look inside to know what was happening. He had seen that kind of silence before, in victims, in widows, in the eyes of those who had lost something no one could return. But there was something about her that held him there longer than usual. Maybe it was the way she shielded the child from the world. Maybe it was the quiet courage in her brokenness. He turned away, his expression unreadable, and walked toward his study. The night still hummed outside, but inside those walls, something new had begun. The storm had not just passed. It had left behind two souls washed raw, unknowingly tethered by fate. Morning came quietly. Light slid through the curtains in thin gold lines, touching the edges of the room where the storm had once whispered. The mansion breathed differently in daylight, no longer menacing, only vast and strangely calm. The woman woke first. For a few seconds, she forgot where she was. Then memory returned, and she stayed still, afraid to move in case this warmth proved to be a dream. Her daughter still slept beside her, one hand open on the pillow, face soft, unbruised by worry. Outside, birds called from the wet trees. Their sound was small but real, and it felt like permission to breathe. Elena stood, every muscle stiff from nights spent running. She looked around, walls of cream and dark wood, a tray by the door with untouched food, a folded dress left neatly on a chair. Someone had thought of everything, and Owen had done that for her in years. And another wing of the house. Damien Moretti watched the rain dry from his balcony. The city below glittered, clean and distant. He had not slept. His mind had wandered through old ghosts, his mother's voice, his father's silence, the code he'd built his empire on, power, respect, loyalty, words that kept men alive. Yet last night had reminded him of another word he had almost forgotten, mercy. He thought of the woman and the child, of how small they had looked beneath the downpour. He hadn't planned to keep them here. He didn't plan anything when he stepped out of that car. But something about the scene refused to leave his thoughts. He left the balcony and walked the long corridor to his study. Reports waited on his desk. Men waited for orders. Money waited to be moved. But his eyes stayed on the rain-stained window. Downstairs, the household moved quietly around its new guests. The older housekeeper, silent and efficient, guided Elena to breakfast without questions. The child woke, blinking at the brightness, then smiled simply because there was food and warmth. The sight of that smile made Elena's throat tighten. She had forgotten what her daughter looked like when she wasn't afraid. Hours slipped by. The house seemed to sense the fragility of the moment. No doors slammed, no voices rose. When afternoon came, Elena stood by the tall window, watching sunlight catch on the wet garden. The flowers outside bent under leftover raindrops, heavy but unbroken. She understood that feeling. Somewhere behind her, footsteps approached, measured, deliberate, familiar. She didn't turn. The air shifted, the way it does when presence itself is weight. The footsteps stopped a few paces away, and words were spoken. None were needed. For a long time, nothing moved except the dust in the sunlight. Then the footsteps retreated again, leaving only the echo of silence and the faint scent of rain that followed him wherever he went. That evening, when the sky dimmed and the city lights flickered on one by one, the mansion settled into stillness. Elena sat by her daughter's bedside, combing her fingers gently through the child's hair. The small girl drifted into sleep, safe for the first time in too long. Outside, Damien stood at his window once more, watching the same rain clouds that had brought them here fade into the horizon. He didn't know why he had stopped the car that night. He didn't know what he planned to do next, but he knew this. Something inside him had shifted, something he had buried beneath years of ruthlessness and discipline. He had built a world that bowed to his command, yet one glance into a pair of frightened eyes had undone its certainty. The storm was over, but its echo remained. It lingered in the halls, in the quiet breathing of a sleeping child, in the soft rustle of a woman's borrowed dress. For Damien Moretti, the most dangerous man in the city, the rain had brought not chaos but clarity, and somewhere deep within him, though he would never admit it aloud, a promise began to form, to protect what fate had left on his doorstep, to make the night mean something more than survival. Above the mansion, the sky cleared, leaving a single streak of light across the clouds. It touched the wet pavement where the car had stopped, the same place where fear had turned into rescue, and beneath that pale light, the story of two broken souls quietly began. The rain had slowed by morning, leaving the streets slick with memories of the night. Pale sunlight fought through the clouds, spilling a cold gray light across the quiet road, where a black car was parked near the curb. Inside it, warmth hummed gently, a contrast to the world outside. The woman, her body trembling from exhaustion, lay on the leather seat with her little girl wrapped in her arms. The child's breathing was soft, her tiny chest rising and falling in peace she hadn't felt in weeks. The man who found them, the one whose name whispered fear in the underworld, sat at the wheel in silence. His eyes, cold and sharp, now softened as he watched the reflection of the mother and daughter through the rearview mirror. He didn't speak. He never did when words weren't necessary. He simply drove, through puddles, through silence, through the weight of things he couldn't yet name. The city awoke slowly. Markets opened, buses rumbled, and people hurried into their routines. But for him, time had slowed. He could still see her face under the rain, broken, fragile, yet filled with a stubborn kind of courage. The kind he had seen only once before, in his mother. When they reached his mansion, the world seemed to pause. The guards stood at attention, their faces tightening in confusion when they saw the woman and the child. Their boss never brought anyone home. Never. His house wasn't a place for comfort. It was where strategies were built and enemies were erased. But this morning, it felt different. He stepped out first, tall and intimidating, his dark coat brushing the ground. Then he opened the back door and carefully lifted the sleeping child into his arms. The mother stirred, startled, her eyes meeting his, but before fear could return, she saw something unexpected there. Stillness. Not pity. Not lust. Just a steady kind of strength, the kind that promised safety. Inside the house, warmth flooded through polished marble floors and flickering fireplaces. The child's small fingers clutched his shirt unconsciously, and something inside him broke, quietly, without sound. He called his housekeeper, a woman who had known him since boyhood, and instructed her to prepare a room. No questions asked. Hours passed. The woman awoke to the scent of warm soup and soft linen. For a moment, she didn't know where she was, only that the rain had stopped, and her daughter was smiling in her sleep. The man stood near the window, hands in his pockets, staring out at the gardens. He looked like power carved from silence. But inside him, memories stirred, his mother's voice teaching him to never raise his hand against a woman, to never use strength as a weapon against those already broken. That voice had kept him human in a world that tried to strip humanity away. Now, as he looked at the bruises on the woman's skin, that voice echoed louder. He didn't ask her name.
He didn't need to.
He understood pain when he saw it. He understood the look of someone who had finally stopped running because there was nowhere left to go. Outside, the city kept moving, unaware that somewhere in the mansion of one of its most feared men, something extraordinary was happening, the quiet rebirth of Mercy. For the next few days, she barely spoke. She moved through the house like a ghost, helping where she could, always watching her daughter as though afraid someone might take her away again. The man, whose name made rivals tremble, watched her from a distance. Not out of curiosity, but protection. He had given orders no one understood. She was to be treated with respect, her child to be kept safe, and any man who dared speak against them would answer directly to him. His men obeyed. They always did. But whispers filled the corridors.
Who is she?
Why did their ruthless leader suddenly have a woman and a child under his roof? The truth was simple. He didn't know why either. All he knew was that he couldn't leave them in the rain. Each night, he found himself walking past their room. The faint sound of a lullaby would drift through the door. A mother's voice, cracked yet full of love. It tugged at something deep within him, something buried under years of violence and vengeance. He remembered his mother again, the one woman who made him promise that no matter how dark his world became, he would never hurt another woman. Because men who harm women, she said, are already dead inside. That memory became his anchor. And now, as he stood outside the woman's room one night, listening to the soft hum of her song, he realized that promise was the only pure thing he had ever kept. But promises have consequences, because the moment he decided to protect her, He declared war without even knowing it, against her abusive husband, against her past, and against everything that had broken her before. The storm that had brought her into his world was only the beginning. Days melted into quiet weeks inside the mansion. The woman slowly began to breathe again. Not freely, not yet, but without fear. Each morning, she would step onto the balcony and watch her daughter play in the sunlight that filtered through the tall glass windows. The sound of laughter had been foreign to her ears for too long. Now, it filled corners of the house that had never known peace. The Mafia boss, Damien, kept his distance. But distance was a lie. He saw everything. He saw how she always checked the doors twice before sleeping, how she flinched at sudden sounds, how she stared at her reflection, as if trying to recognize the woman who once believed in happiness. He didn't need to ask. He understood pain like others understood language. A night, the mansion would fall into silence, the kind that held secrets instead
Of peace.
Damien often found himself standing at the edge of the hallway, watching the lights fade under her door. There was something sacred about the way that small room glowed faintly, a symbol of life he had not realized he missed. But outside his walls, shadows moved. Her husband, the man who had broken her, had begun to search, not out of love, out of control. He had lost his property, his pride, his possession, the woman he thought he owned, and men like him didn't stop. They hunted. Damien's men had already traced the man's movements. Files lay open on his desk, names, deaths, photographs of bruises documented by neighbors who never dared speak. He looked at them in silence, his jaw tightening. He had seen enemies of power, men who ruled streets with guns and cruelty. But this was different. This was the kind of evil that hid behind a wedding ring and a smile. Damien's code was simple. Women and children were off limits. Always. And this man had violated everything Damien believed, kept the darkness human. One night, the storm returned, rain against glass, thunder echoing like heartbeats in the distance. Damien stood outside under the downpour, his cigarette burning faintly in the dark. He remembered his mother again, her laughter, her warmth, her voice telling him, "Protect, never destroy." He had destroyed so many men for power, but now, for the first time, destruction felt like justice. He gave an order, softly, without rage, just certainty. His men understood immediately. By the next morning, her husband's world began to collapse. His accounts were frozen, his business partners withdrew. His father-in-law, the man who had once sold his daughter to pay off his debt, received a call that changed everything. The debt, once erased, was now multiplied tenfold. But this time, it was the abusive husband who owed, not to criminals, but to the law itself, which Damien had carefully turned against him. The woman didn't know. She simply woke up to a morning quieter than usual, unaware that the man who had haunted her dreams was being stripped of everything he had ever used to control her. For Damien, it wasn't about revenge. It was balance. He didn't kill him. He didn't need to. He just made sure the world saw what kind of man he truly was, and when the papers were signed, when the divorce became legal, clean, undeniable, Damien's mother arrived. She came quietly, like light through curtains. Her son greeted her with the same respect he always had, but there was something softer in his eyes this time. Something she hadn't seen since he was a boy. When she saw the woman and her daughter, she didn't ask questions, she only smiled. That knowing, gentle smile mothers carry when they see truth before it's spoken. The little girl ran to her instantly, fearless, and something shifted in the air, as though the mansion, for the first time in years, had allowed love to enter. Days later, laughter became familiar again. The woman began to heal, not because her bruises faded, but because she was finally seen. And Damien, the man who had built empires from blood, began to understand what power truly meant. It wasn't control. It was protection. It was silence filled with purpose. It was knowing that sometimes the strongest men are those who choose not to hurt when they easily could. His mother would watch him from afar, eyes proud and wet with quiet tears. She knew her son, the man feared by all, had finally become what she always prayed he would be, a protector. One evening, As the sun dipped behind the city skyline, Damien stood by the window watching the little girl draw pictures on the floor, her laughter echoing softly through the room. For the first time, he smiled, not the kind that hid pain, but the kind that promised change. He didn't say the words, but he felt them. "I'll protect you both. For as long as I live." The rain began again, gentle this time, like a blessing instead of a curse, and inside that mansion, 3 hearts, once strangers, once broken, began to heal beneath it. The storm had passed, not just the one outside, but the one inside their lives. Days began to stretch like quiet prayers. In the mansion where silence once lived, warmth began to bloom. The scent of fresh bread in the mornings, the sound of a child's laughter echoing through marble halls, these things, once foreign, now belonged. The woman had started to smile again. It wasn't full, not yet, but it reached her eyes now. Her hands, once trembling, found steadiness in small routines, folding the child's clothes, tending to the flowers that had been long forgotten in the garden. The earth under her fingers reminded her she was still alive, and Damien watched. Always from a distance, he didn't interfere. He simply made sure the world around her stayed safe, quiet and undisturbed. His men had new orders, ones they never thought they'd hear. To keep the peace, not to enforce it through fear. His mother often visited now. She filled the air with gentle warmth, the kind that drew out laughter like sunlight coaxing open petals. She and the woman would sit together in the garden sometimes, 2 souls connected by pain and patience. Damien would watch from the balcony. He never joined, but every time his mother's laughter intertwined with a woman's softer chuckles, something deep inside him loosened, like a knot untying after years of being strangled tight. The little girl became his shadow. She wandered into his office without fear, bringing crayons and paper, spreading her world of colors across his desk filled with maps and ledgers. Her presence was like spring entering winter, stubborn, unstoppable, innocent, at first. He tried to ignore it, but she had a way of existing that left no space for walls. She didn't ask questions. She simply trusted, and in her trust, he found something he didn't know he was missing: redemption. He would often find himself pausing mid-work, watching her draw a house with 3 stick figures, a woman, a little girl, and a tall man with dark hair. He didn't need to ask who they were. It stirred something unfamiliar, not weakness, but tenderness, a kind of strength he had never been taught in the streets, only in his mother's eyes. Outside the mansion, the world still whispered his name with fear, but inside, he had become something else, quiet, present, almost gentle. His men noticed. The tension that once wrapped around his presence had softened. He still commanded authority, but now it came with calm. One evening, as twilight spread across the city, he stood by the window again. The rain had started, a soft drizzle that kissed the glass. He could hear laughter downstairs, the little girl chasing the family cat, her mother watching with a tired but peaceful smile. It was a simple scene, ordinary, fragile, but to him, it felt like everything. He remembered the boy he used to be, the one who hid behind his mother's skirts while his father shouted, the one who promised he would never become that kind of man. And now, looking at the life unfolding in his home, he realized he had kept that promise. The woman, once broken, had begun to glow again, quietly, like a candle finding its flame after the wind has passed. She still carried shadows in her eyes, but they no longer ruled her. And though neither of them spoke the words, something had begun between them. Not romance, not yet. Something purer, recognition, a bond built not from desire, but from healing. He respected her silence the way she respected his. Their pain had taught them both the language of stillness. His mother saw it before they did. She would smile each time she watched them in the same room, not touching, not talking, but somehow reaching for each other without moving an inch. One night, she told him, gently, that sometimes love doesn't arrive with thunder, but with rain.
Soft. Steady.
Life-giving, and that perhaps the storm had brought her to him for a reason. He didn't answer, but that night, he didn't leave his window until dawn. The next morning, the little girl ran into his study again, barefoot, her laughter filling the air like sunlight. She carried a small drawing, another house, another set of stick figures. But this time, she had drawn a heart above them. He stared at it for a long moment, then looked at her. The child who had unknowingly changed everything about him. He placed the drawing on his desk, beside his weapons and files, a fragile symbol of everything he'd once thought he couldn't have. Outside, the rain continued, not as a storm, but as a song, and within that house, beneath its rhythm, 3 lives began to grow toward light. Time had begun to move gently. The mansion that once echoed, with footsteps of men who carried guns and secrets, now carried softer sounds. The hum of the kettle in the morning, the shuffling of small feet, the distant notes of music his mother liked to play when she visited. Damien had never understood peace. Not really. To him, silence had always been dangerous, the moment before a bullet or betrayal. But now, silence felt different. It felt alive. He found himself waking before dawn, standing by the window, watching the city wake below. His life, once built around power and fear, now revolved around something simple: keeping that little girl and her mother safe. The woman, strong, quiet, healing, had begun to take life in her hands again. She had started helping the staff, tending to the gardens, laughing a little louder each day. There was a lightness in her steps that hadn't been there before. And though her scars remained, they had begun to look like proof of survival instead of shame. Damien's mother saw it all and smiled with pride. She often said that the mansion finally breathed again, that laughter and life had chased away the ghosts that used to linger in its halls. But for Damien, something deeper was happening, something he couldn't name. It wasn't love, not in the way the world understood it. It was something more sacred, something that made him gentler without weakening him, quieter without dulling his power. He had started to watch her differently, not with desire, but with awe. The way she knelt to tie her daughter's shoes, the way her hair caught sunlight in the mornings, the way her eyes softened whenever she looked at her child. Each gesture carried a kind of grace he didn't know could exist in the same world as men like him. Sometimes, he wondered how she still had the strength to smile, how someone who had been through so much pain could still bring warmth into every room she entered. He didn't realize it, but that question was his answer. She was the reason he had changed, the reason his men now walked with less violence in their eyes, the reason his empire, once ruled by fear, now operated with a strange kind of order, calm, disciplined, clean. He had started to make different choices, cutting ties with traffickers, refusing blood deals, protecting instead of destroying. And though no one dared ask why, everyone knew it was because of her, because of the quiet power she carried without knowing it. One evening, he stood outside by the garden where she often sat with her daughter. The child was sleeping, her small head resting on her mother's lap. The woman was looking up at the sky, her face calm, her body still. The air smelled like rain, the same kind that had brought her to him that night. He thought about how everything had changed since then, not suddenly, but slowly, like dawn replacing the night, and for the first time, he realized he wasn't afraid anymore. Not of feeling, not of losing control. He had spent his life avoiding weakness, but now he saw that gentleness wasn't weakness at all. It was the truest form of strength. Inside, his mother watched from the balcony, a quiet smile on her lips. She had prayed for years that her son would find something to save him from himself. Now, she knew that prayer had been answered, not through power or forgiveness, but through love disguised as responsibility. Later that night, Damien stood alone in his study. The room smelled faintly of gun oil and old wood, symbols of the man he had been, but on his desk lay a child's drawing, crumpled at the edges, colored with too much red and yellow, a house to a woman, a man to a child, and a sun that shone above them all. He looked at it for a long time. Then, for the first time in years, he closed his eyes and let the memory of his mother's voice fill the silence. Honor women. Protect them. And when love finds you, don't fight it. When he opened his eyes again, something inside him had shifted. He wasn't just the man who ruled the streets anymore. He was the man who had finally understood what it meant to be human. Outside, rain began to fall again, soft, endless, forgiving. It slid down the glass like blessings, washing away the remnants of a past that no longer belonged to him. And in that moment, beneath the rain, Damien knew that everything he had built, everything he had destroyed, had led him here, to a woman who taught him mercy, and a little girl who taught him love. The storm that once defined his life had finally passed. All that remained was the sound of rain, gentle, healing, eternal. The world had changed quietly, not with noise or fire, but with peace, the kind that comes after a storm has exhausted itself. Months had passed since that night of rain, since the moment fate placed a broken woman and her child in the path of a man feared by many, but truly known by none. Damien's mansion no longer looked like a fortress. Flowers now climbed its walls. The garden was alive again, full of laughter, of footsteps too small to belong to soldiers. The men who once moved through its corridors with cold precision now walked slower, softer. Even they had changed, their rough edges worn down by the warmth that now lived inside those walls. The woman had found her rhythm in this new life. She still woke early, still flinched sometimes at thunder, still carried memories she would never speak aloud. But she no longer looked lost. She had built something, not from money, not from power, but from peace. The little girl had become the heart of the house. Her laughter could be heard everywhere, from the kitchen to the garden, from the hallways to Damien's once empty study. She had filled every shadow with light. And wherever she was, Damien wasn't far. He had become something the world outside would never believe. Gentle. The same man who had ruled the city through silence and fear now spent his mornings watching a child feed birds in the garden. He still carried power in every glance, every step, but it was no longer the kind that destroyed. It was the kind that protected. Sometimes he thought about the man he used to be, ruthless, calculated, invincible. The man who trusted no one, who believed kindness was weakness. That man was gone, replaced by someone his mother would finally recognize. His mother still visited often. She would sit by the window with tea, watching her son with quiet pride. She had prayed that life would return him to grace before it was too late. Now, she saw that prayer answered in the form of a woman and a child who had walked into his life drenched in rain. The woman, too, had changed. She had grown softer, but not fragile, the kind of softness that comes with strength earned through pain. Her scars were still there, but she wore them differently now. Not as reminders of what broke her, but as proof of what she survived, and Damien, for all his silence, had become her shield. He never said what he felt, but he didn't need to. It was in the way he made sure her world stayed safe. The way he lingered near the child whenever thunder rolled. The way he looked at her, not as someone he had saved, but as someone who had saved him. The divorce had been finalized. Her past, legally and spiritually, was gone. The abusive husband, once loud, once cruel, now lived in ruin. His debts were heavy, his power stripped. Damien never touched him physically. He didn't need to. Justice came quietly, through papers, signatures, and the weight of truth. The day the final document was signed, rain began to fall again, as though the heavens remembered how it all began. She stood by the window, watching droplets trace paths down the glass. Behind her, the mansion hummed with life. The little girl was playing in the hall. Damien's footsteps approached, slow, steady, calm.
He didn't speak.
He never did. But she felt it, the peace between them, the quiet understanding that words would never capture. Outside, the world went on. Inside, life had begun anew. Seasons passed. The garden flourished. The mansion was no longer a symbol of fear, but of shelter. Damien's empire changed too, cleaner, quieter, built not on fear but on respect. His mother often said that the house was finally what it was meant to be, a home, and one evening, years later, the same rain returned, soft, endless, familiar. The little girl, now older, ran into the garden laughing. Her mother followed, her laughter mixing with the sound of falling water. Damien stood by the doorway, watching, the same way he had that first night, except this time, there was no pain in his eyes. The rain soaked his coat, his hair, his scars, and washed everything away one last time. He watched as the woman lifted her face to the sky, eyes closed, letting the rain kiss her skin. For a moment, he saw her as she had been that first night, broken, lost, terrified, and then as she was now, free. His mother stepped beside him quietly, her voice soft as the rain. She didn't need to say anything. She only smiled because she could see what he had become. The dangerous man, the feared name, the shadowed king of the streets, had finally found his redemption not through power or vengeance, but through love, not the kind that burned, but the kind that healed, not the kind that demanded, but the kind that gave. And as the rain continued to fall, Damien finally stepped outside, into the same storm that once brought her to him. He let it wash over him, over them all. The past was gone, the pain was gone. Only peace remained. Under that sky, beneath that rain, three souls who had once been strangers stood together. A man reborn, a woman restored, and a child who had unknowingly saved them both. The mansion lights glowed behind them, warm against the gray horizon. The world would still call him dangerous, ruthless, untouchable. But in truth, he was something far greater, a protector, a father, a man who had learned that mercy is the truest form of power. The rain fell harder, he smiled, and the story, their story, came full circle beneath the rain.